Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the European Marine Board Thursday Science webinar. My name is Britt Alexander and I'm a Science Officer at the EMB and I'll be the moderator for today. So before we start, I will go over the housekeeping rules for the next hour. So make sure that your name is clearly visible in Zoom so you can rename yourself. The second half of this webinar will be a Q&A session, so it's good to know who you are. And also when you ask questions, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, and you can also let us know which organization and country you're from. And I will be selecting questions from the Q&A box to ask to our speakers today. If you're having any technical issues, you can write in the chat function and our technical support will try to help you. And for your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed onto our YouTube channel, so it will remain there afterwards to watch later. So the focus for today is on the EMB Future Science Brief Big Data in Marine Science, which we published last year in April. And we're specifically going to be looking at the science behind the chapter on climate and marine biogeochemistry. So we're joined today by Dr Dorothee Bakker, and she was one of the co-authors of the Climate and Marine Biogeochemistry chapter. So she will be giving a talk for around 30 minutes. Dorothee is an associate professor in marine biogeochemistry at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And she studies the marine carbon cycle and contributes to multidisciplinary seagoing projects. Her research interests include ocean uptake of carbon dioxide, processes driving variation in this uptake, progression of ocean acidification, and the land-to-ocean carbon transfer. She's also the chair of the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas, which is called SOCAT for short. And this is a high-profile synthesis activity, which is led by marine scientists worldwide. So she's going to be telling us a bit more about that as part of her presentation. And during the Q&A, we'll also be joined by Dr. Tjiputra, and he was the other co-author for the Climate and Marine Biogeochemistry chapter. So he's got expertise in modeling, so we'll be asking him some questions related to that. Jerry is a research professor at the Norwegian Research Centre, NORCE, and the Bjerknes Centre for Climate Research in Norway. His research focuses on advancing our understanding of the role of the ocean carbon cycle in the climate system, and he uses state-of-the-art Earth system models complemented by large arrays of physical and biogeochemical observations across various temporal and spatial scales. Oh, that's for later. So I will now pass over to Dorothee to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Britt. And I hope that my screen is now very large and you can all see it well. So today I'd like to present to you the value chain of measurements of carbon dioxide in the oceans. And as Britt says, Jerry Tjiputra and I, and also Britt, contributed to a chapter in a report on big data and marine science. And specifically in this talk, I'd like to highlight the value chain of ocean CO2 measurements that we presented in this chapter. And one of the important parts of the value chain are two synthesis products where we bring measurements together. These products are called GLODAP and SOCAT, and these products have more than 100 contributors. So indirectly, all these contributors also feed into this talk. So on the left, the cover of the report on big data and marine science. And here I'll focus on chapter 2 on climate and marine biogeochemistry. The report was on big data. So what are big data? Big data have a large volume. They arrive at relatively high speed, so at velocity. There's large variety of these data, both in the type of data, but also in the platforms on which they are collected. These data have veracity. In our community, we'd probably call this accuracy. So the data are trustworthy and we know their uncertainty. And these data have a value. It costs money to collect the data. It also costs money to put the data together in synthesis products. But then there are huge benefits to these measurements and to using the synthesis products. So throughout the talk, I've highlighted which of these 5 V's for the big data apply. As this was a report for the European Marine Board, we also highlighted European data infrastructures. So some of these are CDataNet, the Copernicus Marine Service, EMODNet, and ICOS. So ICOS is an integrated, it's a European research infrastructure, and it is an integrated carbon observing system. And ICOS has an ocean component, and the ocean component of ICOS makes measurements of carbon dioxide in the oceans and contributes to the 2 data synthesis products that I'll talk about. So why do we do these measurements? We do this because we want to quantify the uptake of carbon dioxide by the oceans. So by our human activities, by driving cars, by heating our homes, we are using fossil fuels, and we release large quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that is shown here on the left as sources of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Then where does this carbon dioxide go? Well, about half of it stays in the atmosphere, and this leads to increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide, and this then leads to climate change and global warming. 30% of the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere go into land systems, plants and soils, and 1/4 of the CO2 emissions are taken up by the oceans. And that's the topic of today's talk and of the value chain of ocean CO2 measurements. So this graph shows, with the red curve, the increase of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. I should say that this is a smoothed time series. In reality, the atmospheric CO2 concentrations also have seasonal variation, and so that's been smoothed out by a running mean. Then the blue curve shows the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the surface oceans, and you can see that the surface ocean CO2 level is increasing in parallel with the atmospheric CO2 level. So this is evidence that the oceans are taking up carbon dioxide as the atmospheric CO2 level is increasing. When carbon dioxide is taken up by the ocean, it dissolves, and this changes the chemistry of the oceans. And one of the variables that changes is the pH of the oceans, the acidity of the oceans. And you can see that here in the green curve. The green curve shows that the pH of the surface oceans decreases when the oceans are taking up carbon dioxide. And we refer to this process as ocean acidification. This figure shows the value chain of CO2 measurements in the oceans. So at the bottom of the value chain are the measurements of CO2 in the upper ocean, but also in the interior ocean. These measurements are also supported by observation systems, and two of these are shown here, ICOS in Europe and SOCONET, which is an international observing system. Then the measurements feed into synthesis products, and I'll show more about these later, SOCAT and GLODAP. And then the synthesis products are used in a large number of scientific studies, and I'll talk about that. And then these scientific studies feed into scientific assessments and synthesis reporting, and then this feeds into climate negotiations. And here we are now at the top of this pyramid. And then there also is a feedback from the scientific assessments and from the climate negotiations back to the observations and the synthesis products. So the aim of all this, or at least some of the aims of all this, are to constrain the uptake of carbon dioxide by the global oceans, as well as its variation and also its future variation to better than 0.2 petagram of carbon per year. The aims also include to quantify the progression of ocean acidification. And the aims include to determine the drivers of ocean CO2 uptake and ocean acidification, as well as of any variation in ocean CO2 uptake and ocean acidification. So I'll first like to talk about the in situ oceanographic CO2 measurements and about our quality control and synthesis into data products. So when we set out on research ships, we deploy a water sampler here shown in the bottom left to take samples of the interior ocean. So this is the ocean from the sea surface right to the bottom of the seafloor. And when this water sampler returns on deck, we take samples for all kinds of variables, including for carbon variables. And then with great care, we measure, for example, the dissolved inorganic carbon concentration, the alkalinity, the pH of the water. And you can see some examples of how these analyses are carried out on a ship. And then once colleagues around the world are happy with their data, they have done all the checks they can do, they make these data available for data synthesis, and that's what we do in GLODAP. First, the data in GLODAP are put in a uniform format, and then the GLODAP key team carry out quality control, secondary quality control on these data. So GLODAP stands for the Global Data Analysis Project, and it contains interior ocean carbon and other observations. Currently, the public version is GLODAP version 2 for 2020. And it has data from 1972 to 2019. In total, it has 946 cruises. The figure on the top left shows where these cruises took place. And you can see that many of them are along lines that span east-west or north-south. And the figure on the right shows the number of cruises per year in GLODAP. And for the period from about 2008 to 2015, there were roughly 25 cruises per year with data in GLODAP. So the data are put in a uniform format and they are bias corrected. Core parameters are temperature, salinity, dissolved inorganic carbon, alkalinity, oxygen, nutrients, and freons. And then there are also additional parameters such as pH and carbon isotopes. GLODAP has biannual updates and decadal releases, and a release is planned this autumn. Now, GLODAP has a sister product, which is called SOCAT, the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas. And but where we should start first is with colleagues around the world that make measurements of in situ surface ocean CO2. And they make these measurements on a wide variety of surface platforms. So measurements are made on research ships. They're also made on commercial ships. They're made on cruise ships. And now recently, colleagues have started collecting measurements on sailing yachts and also on autonomous surface vehicles. So all of these platforms move, but we also collect measurements on moorings, and they are fixed. And a large number of colleagues around the world is involved in these measurements and is then also submits their measurements to SOCAT, and there the same community carries out volunteer secondary quality control. So the figure on the top left shows the FCO2 values that we have in SOCAT. And the figure on the right shows the number of FCO2 values per year. And one can see that the number of available values has strongly increased over time, and that currently we collect about 2 million FCO2 values per year. So SOCAT contains FCO2 values, or the fugacity of carbon dioxide, and this is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, but corrected for non-ideal behavior of the gas. And FCO2 and PCO2 are numerically relatively similar, but not entirely. So SOCAT contains in situ FCO2 measurements. We do not have calculated FCO2 values, and all the measurements have been made on surface platforms. The data are in uniform format with secondary quality control, and we do not carry out any gap filling. We have an annual public release in mid-June, and the next release is scheduled for 15 June. So as I said, one of our aims is to determine surface ocean FCO2 with an accuracy of better than 2 microatmosphere to constrain global ocean CO2 uptake to better than 0.2 petagrams of carbon per year. This graph shows the accuracy of the data that we have in SOCAT, and you can see that at the present, if you look at the two blue colors, that the majority of the data that we collect have an accuracy of better than 2 microatmosphere. Then there are also some sea green data with an accuracy of better than 5 microatmosphere, and those are some of the data collected on moorings with very frequent calibration, in situ calibration. Then you can also see that recently we are collecting these data in yellow with an accuracy of better than 10 microatmosphere, and those tend to be data collected by sensors, and they have a somewhat lower accuracy than the shipboard data. So currently we have 28 million FCO2 values with an accuracy better than 5 microatmosphere. And we release these in our main synthesis and gridded products. And we have 2 million FCO2 values with an accuracy of 5 to 10 microatmosphere. And we release these in a separate file. In SOCAT and GLODAP, we aim for the FAIR data standards. And this stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. In this table, I summarized how we are doing on these, and specifically, we are aiming to increase the level in which the two data sets are interoperable. In SOCAT, we are enhancing our metadata upload so that it will be easier to share SOCAT between different machines or computers. And we're also aiming for a common technical platform for SOCAT and GLODAP. So now that I've presented to you the in situ ocean measurements at the bottom of the value chain and the synthesis products, I'd like to show how the measurements and the products are used in scientific studies. So to start, this graph shows the data distribution in SOCAT. And it shows for how many months of the year there are data for a given region. So where the color is red, we have 10 to 12 months of data. And you can see that this is the case for many European areas, and specifically port areas, but also for North America and for Japan. And then you can see also that these red colors occur along shipping lines between, for example, Japan and here going south, but also between Europe and the United States. What the graph also shows is that when we move to the southern hemisphere, that data coverage is not as good. In particular, there are large parts of the oceans where there is no data coverage at all. And there are also large parts of the oceans where maybe we have data for 2 to 4 months of the year. If one of our aims is to quantify uptake of carbon dioxide by the global oceans, then we need to find a way to fill in these gaps. Machine learning and other interpolation methods are used for filling in these gaps. So this slide explains how this is done. We start with a SOCAT synthesis product, and then we combine this with other parameters for which we have good spatial and temporal coverage, such as, for example, sea surface temperature from a satellite, and the mixed layer depth from a reanalysis product. And then statistical methods and also machine learning are used to create continuous maps of surface ocean PCO2, for example, from 1980 to the present for every month of the year. And we can then combine these maps with empirical relationships that links the difference of partial pressure across the sea surface with the wind speed to calculate CO2 air sea fluxes. So that's shown here. This figure here on the top right shows a distribution of CO2 air sea fluxes for the global oceans. So when we do this calculation, we determine the contemporary net CO2 air sea flux. And if we make a correction for riverine outgassing, we can quantify the ocean uptake of carbon dioxide by anthropogenic perturbations. And this figure shows the ocean CO2 uptake in the most recent global carbon budget. And the uptake increases when the values go up. So the blue line shows the mean of the data products based on SOCAT. And you can see individual data products based on SOCAT are shown in those light blue or cyan lines. And then the sea green colors indicate estimates of ocean CO2 uptake by the models. So SOCAT-based products have been informing the global carbon budget on ocean CO2 uptake since 2013. The SOCAT-based products show considerable year-to-year and multi-year variation in ocean CO2 uptake. And I'd like to look at that a bit further on the next slide. So this figure is for the Southern Ocean, south of 35 degrees south. And the green curve and the blue curve show two gap-filling methods. It's important to realize that the scale of this graph is reversed, and now when you go down on the graph, the ocean uptake of carbon dioxide increases. So there's these two estimates of ocean CO2 uptake in blue and in green. You can see that the two estimates differ. They're not identical. You can also see that there is a considerable year-to-year variation in both products, and also that they have longer-term variation. Specifically, these two products indicate that the Southern Ocean CO2 sink has been increasing from about 2001 onwards to roughly 2010 or 14. Then here's the same figure, and now we're going to focus on the right of the figure. So American colleagues realized that there are very few measurements of carbon dioxide in the Southern Ocean in winter. And their approach was to release a large number of profiling floats equipped with a pH sensor, and they then estimated surface ocean PCO2 from these pH measurements. And if one estimates the Southern Ocean CO2 uptake based on these floats, then one finds an uptake of 0.35 petagram of carbon per year. And that's shown here by this purple square. However, for that same 2-year period, the ship-based estimate would give an estimate of minus 1.14 petagram of carbon per year. So there's quite a large difference between the estimates of the Southern Ocean CO2 uptake between the floats and the ships. And there are several explanations for this. For example, the ships don't have any wintertime measurements, so this could be a seasonal effect. There is also, and certainly the floats are a very strong tool for getting a better grip on the wintertime CO2 fluxes in the Southern Ocean. However, we're not yet fully convinced of the accuracy of these PCO2 values estimated from the floats. There is a chance that are biased somewhat high. And for now, we conclude that we need both the float measurements and the shipboard measurements to get a better grip on Southern Ocean CO2 uptake. So now we get to GLODAP. The interior ocean measurements in GLODAP can be used to quantify the extra carbon in the oceans. And this figure shows a cross-section of the 3 ocean basins, and the colors indicate the amount of extra carbon in the oceans that's been taken up between 1994 and 2007. And this uptake equates to an uptake of 2.6 petagram of carbon per year over this time period. One can also use GLODAP to compare it to models, and an example is shown here. So the uptake of extra carbon in the North Atlantic Ocean is shown for GLODAP in the figure on the bottom right. And it's shown for 11 Earth system models in the other figures. So one can use the synthesis products to evaluate the models. And then this, for example, this article continues to identify statistical methods that can be used for assessing the model performance. GLODAP can also be used to determine monthly climatologies for interior ocean concentrations of dissolved inorganic carbon. So what is shown here is actually the annual mean climatology for dissolved inorganic carbon, but for 3 different depths. So the larger figure is for the surface ocean, and then the figure on the bottom left is for 100 meters depth, and the figure on the bottom right is for 1,000 meters depth. And this then allows a study, if one uses the monthly maps, of the processes that are driving seasonal variation in dissolved inorganic carbon in the oceans. So now that we've looked at some of the scientific studies that use the observations and that use the synthesis products, I'd now like to discuss how this feeds into scientific assessments and into climate negotiations. And also I'd like to discuss the feedback from these climate negotiations and the scientific assessments back to the observations. So SOCAT and GLODEP are used in hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles and reports, and this includes IPCC reports, and these reports inform policymakers. For example, SOCAT and GLODEP are used to quantify the ocean carbon sink, to quantify the progression of ocean acidification. They're also used for sensor evaluation, and these are sensors on biogeochemical Argo floats, on gliders and on moorings. And SOCAT and GLODEP are also used for model evaluation. For example, SOCAT is available as an ESM VAL tool, and it's also available in OPS4MIP. And this is important for IPCC related modeling. So with all this information, the IPCC writes its reports, and negotiations take place in the context of the United Framework Convention for Climate Change. And then the United Framework Convention for Climate Change sets policy aims. Specifically, 196 countries agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius during as part of the Paris Agreement. And such an agreement between countries then should feed into government policy and ideally also into national and regional research funding. There are also global initiatives by the United Nations to encourage countries to then provide, either take measures, but also to provide relevant measurements. And one of the bodies responsible for this is the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, the SBSTA. It supports the climate negotiations and it promotes research and systematic observation of the climate system. In addition, the United Nations have developed Sustainable Development Goals, and goals 13 and 14 are particularly relevant for ocean CO2 measurements. The UN has declared a decade of ocean science for sustainable development, and 2021 is the first year of this decade. And this in response to this, we have set out our vision for integrated ocean carbon research in a report, and the reference is below, and it gives a vision for coordinated ocean carbon research and observations for the next decade. Then IPCC reports, they indicate the confidence in their statements, and they also identify what is missing in terms of information and knowledge. And that then can trigger scientists to do new research. Then the international bodies, GOOS and JCOS, identify essential climate variables and essential ocean variables, and these can be important for monitoring activities. So ideally, all of this feeds back into the observations. And however, this actually quite recently, our community has really been quite struggling to get sustained research funding. And in my view, one of the problems is that we are moving in our community from blue skies research, where we're studying really interesting processes, to climate monitoring. Many of us are now carrying out repeat observations, or we're trying to maintain time series. And these are all very important for climate monitoring, but in many countries, they don't quite fall under the research funding mechanisms. Dr. Tanua stated 2 years ago that 80% of our so-called sustained ocean observing system is funded by research funding. And this means that our sustained observing system is very vulnerable, and it relies on the skill of individual researchers to attract research funding. And at Hill, and I see that he's going to give your next seminar, declared in 2019 that we need a new funding model for sustained in situ ocean climate observations. So yes, in order for us to be able to deliver this value chain for ocean CO2 measurements long term, we also need to have sustained long-term funding for the observations and for the synthesis products. So we published the value chain as part of chapter 2 of a report on big data and marine science. This chapter has a number of additional recommendations, and here are listed some of these. We would need a high-level agreement so that we can make in situ surface ocean CO2 observations in exclusive economic zones. And such an agreement is in place for weather observations. And I'd like to argue that our measurements are of equal importance and that we also need an agreement so we can continue to make our measurements in exclusive economic zones. In our community, we should aim to adopt operational data standards using the FAIR principles. And we should continue to coordinate best practice for ocean observations. We should use or continue to use digital object identifiers for data citation. And we should make much more progress on integrating diverse data into data products. And this ends my talk.
Hey, thank you very much, Dorothy. So we'll move on to the Q&A session now. So please, if you have any questions for Dorothy about her talk, please enter them in the Q&A. And also, if you have questions for Jerry, you can indicate if your question is specifically for Jerry or Dorothy or both as well. So I will start by inviting Jerry to join the conversation. Are you still there, Jerry?
Yes, I am.
Hello. So I have a question about the role of the modeling community in the ocean carbon measurement value chain. And maybe you can start off by telling us a bit more about that.
That's a good question. So I think when we discussed about the value of the modeling big data when we wrote the report, but we decided that I think it's more useful for the community to focus on the actual observations. So in the modeling, from the modeling side, we don't have this nice pyramid of value chain that Dorothy showed, but the model is closely collaborate with the observing community in terms of using this data that they collect and all the efforts that they put in it. So it starts with the data collections from the very bottom with this ship measurements, whether it's float, whether it's mooring. They are closely being used to develop the model very early on in terms of assessing the model in simulating processes at regional scale and how they vary, the carbon system, how they vary to environmental variability. And as we go to the next step, when the observational community develop this map, synthesis of SOCAT and GLODAP, we still use them to evaluate the model in terms of whether the model now able to capture the large scale feature, the global variability, from large-scale features like the upwelling systems, or in the oligotrophic open ocean system, how the carbon system vary, and compare that with the model. And we also participate in projecting the CO2 uptake. So SOCAT, as Dorothee mentioned, is actively being used for global carbon budget annually since 2013. And this is very similarly the case for the modeling community. So the model that once they have been quality control and heavily validated against observations, we also participate in this exercise. We run the model simulations. There are quite a number of modeling community around the world that produce this model and produce these simulations that then also provide estimates of evolutions of global carbon uptake into the ocean and over the historical period. And this also, together with the data synthesis that Dorothee mentions, also fit into the high-level report, such as the IPCC and then the global carbon budget. And the last thing I want to say is that the modeling community also play a role in terms of giving feedback to the observing community. We use the model also to evaluate whether we do really need to fill up the gap that Dorothee showed, for example, in the South Pacific, where we don't have any observations at all. The model is quite useful to tell whether how important or at which period do we need to actually collect these observations and fill in the gap, and essentially to reduce the uncertainty of the global carbon uptake, for example. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jerry. Do you have anything to add to that, Dorothee?
No, not really.
No, okay, we can move on then to, we've got a few questions that have come in the Q&A. So we've got a question from Toste Tanhua. So he says, in your opinion, what would be the most important steps towards a more sustainable funding model for ocean, carbon, and climate observations, including the whole value chain from observations, data, products, assimilation, and assessments?
That's quite a question, Toste. So I'll try to answer it. I think that in individual countries, that specific research groups should be funded on for at least 5 years, and possibly 5-year rolling funding, to collect measurements in the surface ocean, for example, on ships of opportunity, on commercial ships or on cruise ships. And also there should be a parallel or adequate investment in equipment. And then also for countries, they should come up with a plan to carry out deep sections. Maybe these should be 5-year plans. Making these measurements of carbon in the interior ocean is actually very time consuming. Most research groups can handle only 1 or 2 of these sections per year. So in smaller countries, it's often a collaboration of different groups within a country. So there should be a slightly longer term plan for carrying out these plan, but also with funding for carrying out these deep sections. And then for SOCAT and GLODEP, the synthesis products, we should consider how much manpower is really needed for putting them together, and specifically also for the data management and also for the volunteer quality control efforts. And this should be funded by the countries that also invest in the data collection of surface ocean and deep ocean carbon measurements. And I hope that answers most of your question.
Thanks, Dorothee. Seems like a very comprehensive answer to me. So we've got a few more questions in the Q&A. We've got one from Brian Ward about your presentation. What is the MLD reanalysis product you mentioned? And also, what is the Gray-et-al reference you showed for the SO plot?
Okay, Brian. I can't remember what the mixed layer depth reanalysis product is. I would need to check the papers by Peter Landschützer. The Gray-et-al reference, that is a publication from, I think, 2019. And it is the earliest estimates of the Southern Ocean carbon sink based on the floats. And so it's a paper that precedes the Bushinsky paper by about a year or so. And I can't remember the journal. It might be JGR, but I would need to check.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy. We also have a question from Tiago Monteiro. He says, do you intend to enter pH data in the next versions of SOCAT? So I think you mentioned they were part of the GLODE app. And there was also one of the recommendations on your last slide is to try to integrate a more diversity of types of data into the data product. So we could even extend to that question. So pH data, but also what other kinds of data could you eventually incorporate into these data products?
Yes, thank you, Tiago. For a long time as a SOCAT community, we've had the ambition to make other data available that are collected in parallel to SOCAT measurements. This was a decision a few years ago, and at that stage we agreed that we were going to make them available, but we would not carry out quality control on these data because frankly we haven't got the manpower or woman power to do that. And this year, more recently, we decided that we're going to invest all our efforts into automating the upload of the metadata in SOCAT, because that is better for making SOCAT interoperable with other data products. So that means that this year we're not putting any effort into incorporating additional data into SOCAT. In the longer term, we would, because partly we're just really short of person power. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. We're short of all these things require a lot of programming. And we have a small team of very dedicated data managers who also do this programming. But we need to be, we can't do more than, you know, how many hours in the week they have. In the longer term, yes, we would like to incorporate additional parameters in SOCAT. We are particularly interested in things like alkalinity, pH, and dissolved inorganic carbon. At the moment, our community is not ready to carry out quality control for additional variables, but one could, and so it would need, we would need to find other ways of doing that, for example, by bringing in more people. In the past, we also had discussions on parallel products for example, other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. These gases are have many things that are quite similar to the way we collect CO2 measurements. So it should not be impossible to adopt many of the methods that we have for SOCAT and apply them for, say, methane and nitrous oxide. But this would really need an extra community to step in and to put in the effort to do that. The bottom line is we're very keen, but we're also very time limited in what we can do. And we're trying to keep realistic, to be realistic, so we can deliver our annual updates on time. Thank you, Tiago.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, another question from Carla Florencia Barikoff. She says, what strategies can be implemented in the future to strengthen the in situ measurements for the Southern Hemisphere so that they can contribute to GLODE Up and SOCAT products in the medium term?
That's an excellent question, Carla. Well, and I don't know immediately the answer to this. A new tool that we have are autonomous service vehicles. And colleagues in the United States, led by Adrian Sutton, have been deploying an autonomous service vehicle, and it's sailed all the way around the Southern Ocean while making CO2 measurements, including in winter. So, and I understand that Adrian and colleagues, or possibly other colleagues, are going to make more of these measurements in the future. So this would be a very powerful tool to make more measurements in winter right at the surface. Previously, also colleagues have been using drifters with CO2 instruments. So that would be another way of making these measurements. One can potentially deploy moorings, but the weather is not very, it's really very, very harsh winter conditions in the Southern Ocean. So the one mooring that I have been involved with in the Southern Ocean really struggled with instrument failure in winter. So that makes it more difficult to collect data. So maybe there's not an easy answer to how we would collect more data in winter in the Southern Ocean, but certainly autonomous vehicles might be a way forward. Thank you.
All right, and we've got the questions keep coming in, so that's great. So we've got a question from Bililu Adekembi, who is asking, in applying the SOCAT and GLODAP data, is it ideal to extrapolate coastal carbonate system dynamics from this database? And he's from the Nigerian Institute for Oceanography and Marine Research.
So Peter Landschützer has used SOCAT data to make I think it's a climatology for coastal waters. Now, I'm not entirely sure how well this would cover the coastal waters near Africa or near Nigeria. I mean, part of the issue would be that there are relatively few data collected in those waters, and all these products become better if they're based on real data in that specific area. The best thing would, you have to always be careful to use these data products in regions where there are relatively few data available. And the best way would be to start collecting more data, maybe by initiating a collaboration with colleagues who have instruments that they are keen to deploy, and they're looking for opportunities where they can deploy them. Yes, extrapolation always has to be a bit careful for, and particularly in coastal waters, the carbonate chemistry is extremely variable, both in space and in time. Space and in time. So the open ocean values tend to be much more within much narrower values than in the coastal waters. The range of the FCO2 values, for example, is much higher than for the open ocean. So one has to be a bit careful of using open ocean data for coastal regions. I hope that answers it.
And we have one more question specifically about the GLODAP from Paula Albarracin. So she says, great talk. And her question is it possible to extract the data on GLODAP and project it in Ocean Data View? I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I'm hoping you do, Dorothy.
Yes, but I don't. So thank you, Paula. Isn't GLODAP already available in Ocean Data View? I think that'd be the first thing to check. So Ocean Data View is software made available by the Alfred Wegener Institute, in particular by Rainer Schlitzer. And I know that SOCAT is made available via Ocean Data View. So I'm just, yes, Tosta has just answered. GLODAP is also available in Ocean Data View. So you do not need to do anything as complicated as extracting the data if you want to use Ocean Data View.
Okay. So we have only 8 minutes left, so I will ask this the last question from Brian Ward, but I will ask it first to Jerry. So do you think ocean's CO2 uptake will become part of carbon emissions trading schemes? And do you think this can be implemented? or Dorothy, if you have some initial ideas.
So do you want to take it, Jerry, or shall I?
Well, you did mention the need to collect observations over the economic zone, and I guess this has to be realized first if we were to consider into the trading scheme for the different nations, I presume here. I'm not so sure how well do we have the data to actually take into consider carbon uptake for the different nations and include this in the trading scheme. So I'm not the right person to answer these questions.
Also, Brian, I guess most ocean scientists like to stay away from politics, and this is venturing into the field of politics. In a way, much of this ocean CO2 uptake happens in the big blue ocean, so well away from national boundaries, well away outside of exclusive economic zones. And in a way, the oceans are providing us a huge service by taking up all this carbon. So I'm not sure that we, personally, I'm very reluctant whether this ocean uptake should be part of carbon emission trading schemes, because some nations might be lucky. They might sit in a region where the oceans are taking up carbon, whereas other regions sit in a region where the oceans are not taking up carbon. And this is just because of the way the ocean physics and the ocean biology works. So I'd be very reluctant if we would include this ocean, basically the uptake of the carbon dioxide by the oceans by relatively natural processes in emission trading schemes. But others may disagree, of course.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy. So I will ask perhaps a more suitable question for Jerry, that's from Sheila, the Executive Director of EMB, who's also a modeler. So she says, how much worse will the models get if we have less data, or conversely, how much better can the predictions get with 10% more data?
Thank you for the question, Sheila. I think it really depends on where do you have this 10% additional more data. So we really need data to calibrate the models, to really understand whether the model is doing the right thing or not. And to know where the model is not doing quite well is to compare the different models where we see big spread in their projections. And there are many places where the models are disagreeing from one another. But I think the priority is really to focus on, for example, regions that we know is important for the questions we want to address. So for the ocean carbon uptake, the North Atlantic and the Southern Oceans are known to be the critical regions. North Atlantic, we have quite good data coverage, as shown by Dorothee's map. In the Southern Oceans, this is completely the opposite, I would say. It's not very much data. And this is also a very critical regions where the ocean carbon sinks happen in the past, but also what we expect in the future. And this is, many studies have shown that the model is going everywhere. Not only in the future projections, but also in terms of the seasonal cycle. And Dorothy already mentions it's quite difficult to do the observations during winter time. So if we can get this high quality observations in the winter time, focus this 10% in the Southern Oceans during this difficult time, I think this will be a very valuable addition and contributions to the modeling community.
Can I add something to that? Sure. I mean, I fully agree with that. We like the 10% in the Southern Ocean in winter. I would like to mention that actually data coverage in the North Atlantic hasn't been as good as in previous years. Two of the long-term observing routes in the North Atlantic have not been operating recently, and at least one of those because of lack of funding. And this is a line between Europe and the United States, or the Caribbean, really, and so funding is actually affecting our measurements at the moment, and the coverage for the North Atlantic is really not as good as it used to be 3, 4, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you both. So I think we're running out of time, actually. Yeah, I think I will. I just have one last slide. Which you've already had a sneak preview of. So our next Third Thursday Science webinar will be on the 17th of June. And we'll be hearing from Professor Ed Hill, the Chief Executive of the NOC in the UK. So this will be a really nice continuation from today's discussion. The webinar will be about sustaining in situ ocean observations for the digital ocean. So basically the next EMB policy brief is going to be on this topic, specifically focusing on sustained funding. And we're going to launch that the day before, so on Wednesday, the 16th of June during the EMODNet conference. So during our next Thursday Science webinar, then Ed will go into a bit more detail on the background of this document, and there'll also be a Q&A session. So we look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. And I'd just like to end by thanking Dorothee and Jerry for joining us today and for telling us about their work towards the Big Data EMB Future Science Brief. So thank you, everyone.